Money doesn't silence people. It teaches them how to forget. For years, one powerful woman perfected that system. Problems appeared, money moved, silence followed. No violence, no scandals. Just disappearance. Until Two Boys Society had already decided didn't matter, realized the silence wasn't emptied. It was documented, it was patterned, and it was her weakness. Eleanor Whitmore did not announce her power. She never had to. It lived in the way rooms adjusted themselves when she entered, in how conversations softened and redirected without instruction, in how decisions were already made before dissent had time to form. She was a woman whose presence carried the quiet authority of inevitability. In public, she was praised as a benefactor, a visionary, a patron of progress. Her name appeared on buildings, foundations, scholarships, and charity galas, always accompanied by words like generosity and leadership. To most people, Eleanor Whitmore represented success refined into responsibility. Money followed her like a shadow that could not be separated from the light. It did not just buy comfort or influence, it created distance. It wrapped her life in layers that few could penetrate and even fewer dared to question. Problems that ruined others never reached her doorstep in recognizable form. They dissolved somewhere in the space between legal teams, private settlements, and quiet conversations held behind closed doors. This was not luck, it was structure. Wealth in her world was not simply possession. It was insulation. To the outside world, Eleanor appeared flawless. She funded youth programs, spoke about equality, and championed causes that aligned neatly with public morality. Her image was carefully maintained, not through loud declarations, but through consistency. Nothing about her seemed excessive or reckless. Even her generosity felt measured, intentional, as if designed to reassure rather than inspire. People trusted her because she never appeared to need anything from them. That absence of need created comfort, and comfort easily turned into belief. Yet beneath the admiration lived something colder. Those who worked closest to her understood that the silence surrounding Eleanor was not born from respect alone. It was cultivated through fear that never needed to raise its voice. People did not question her decisions because questioning felt pointless, even dangerous. Careers stalled quietly. Opportunities disappeared without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving. No one could ever point to a single act of retaliation, and that was precisely the point. The consequences were subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to be understood. In elite spaces, morality did not vanish. It shifted. Right and wrong were no longer absolutes, but considerations weighed against convenience, reputation, and risk. Eleanor did not see herself as immoral. She saw herself as practical. Problems were obstacles, not ethical tests. If a situation threatened stability, it required resolution, not reflection. Money made those resolutions efficient. It transformed conflict into transactions and conscience into paperwork. In her world, silence was not demanded. It was purchased. At first glance, this system appeared harmless, even elegant. No public scandals, no dramatic confrontations, no visible victims. Everything was handled discreetly, professionally, and cleanly. That was the illusion Eleanor trusted most. She believed that order equaled innocence, that chaos was the only sign of guilt. As long as things remained quiet, she assumed nothing was wrong. And for years, the quiet held. But admiration has a way of changing shape. The same people who once spoke her name with reverence began to hesitate, just slightly, before doing so. Not because they knew something specific, but because something felt misaligned. The perfection lingered too long. The generosity never wavered, even when circumstances suggested it should. Slowly, admiration thinned into unease. People sensed that the calm surrounding Eleanor was not natural. It was enforced. The more powerful Eleanor became, the less visible her world was. Distance grew between her and the consequences of her decisions. She no longer encountered disagreement in raw form. Everything arrived filtered, softened, translated into language that preserved her comfort. This distance altered her understanding of accountability. She did not see herself as above others, she saw herself as separate. Separation, after all, is easier to justify than superiority. Her wealth acted as moral armor, deflecting scrutiny before it could settle. Journalists praised her philanthropy. Institutions welcomed her funding. Critics found themselves isolated, uncertain, and alone. No single accusation ever stood long enough to gather momentum. Each concern was addressed individually, quietly, and thoroughly. Eleanor's shield was not aggressive. It was procedural, and procedures, when executed well, rarely attract attention. What Eleanor failed to recognize was that money leaves trails. Every payment, every agreement, every quiet resolution created records, patterns, and absences. The very system designed to erase conflict was documenting it. Each attempt to smooth over reality added another layer to a structure that could be examined. If anyone ever chose to look closely enough, Eleanor trusted that no one would. After all, looking required time, patience, and a perspective untouched by fear or benefit. She believed invisibility was permanent. That assumption shaped her confidence and dulled her caution. She underestimated the power of observation from those who had nothing to lose and nothing to gain from her approval. In her mind, danger came from rivals and critics with platforms. She never considered that scrutiny might come from outside her world entirely, from places where her name held no promise and her money offered no protection. The illusion held because everyone played their part. The powerful accepted her influence. The institutions welcomed her resources. The public admired her generosity. And those who knew more than they should learn to forget. It was a system sustained by convenience, not conspiracy. No one needed to coordinate silence when silence was rewarded. What Eleanor did not understand was that silence is not empty. It accumulates weight. It compresses truth into something denser and more dangerous than noise. The longer it is maintained, the more fragile it becomes. She mistook stillness for stability, unaware that beneath the polished surface, pressure was building. No one noticed that the same money protecting her was quietly building the evidence that would destroy her. There were entire sections of the city Eleanor Whitmore only encountered on maps, shaded in lighter colors and summarized by statistics she never had reason to question. These neighborhoods existed beyond her daily roads, beyond the glass-lined streets and guarded entrances that defined her reality. They were places the city referenced when discussing budgets, reform, or crime rates, but rarely when celebrating progress. The absence was intentional, not malicious, and it functioned so smoothly that most people never noticed it. Eleanor certainly did not. The neighborhood sat several miles from her offices and homes, yet the distance felt far greater. Buildings leaned into one another as if sharing the burden of age and neglect. Paint peeled not from neglect alone, but from repetition, from being repaired just enough to pass inspection and never enough to last. Streets carried the marks of constant use without renewal. Nothing here was designed to impress. Everything was designed to endure. This was not chaos. It was order stripped of comfort. Systems worked just well enough to keep people in place. Buses arrived inconsistently but predictably late. Schools operated with dedication but without resources. Stores stocked necessities and little else. The neighborhood functioned on a logic Eleanor would never have to learn: prepare for disappointment, conserve energy, and trust only what you can see repeated over time. Survival here was not dramatic. It was routine. Systemic poverty did not announce itself through suffering alone. It appeared in limitations. Choices narrowed early, often before children understood that choices were supposed to be abundant. Opportunities were spoken about in abstract terms, distant and conditional. The neighborhood did not crush ambition, it reshaped it. Dreams became practical, then cautious, then quiet. People learned to value stability over possibility, because possibility carried risk they could not afford. Caleb Morris and Darius Cole grew up within this rhythm. They were not defined by tragedy, nor protected by comfort. Their days followed patterns dictated by necessity, school, responsibilities, observation. Their environment sharpened their awareness early. They noticed routines adults ignored, movements others dismissed as background noise. In a place where attention could mean safety, watching closely was not a talent. It was a requirement. The neighborhood taught them that visibility was selective. Authority passed through without stopping. Aid arrived in measured doses, announced loudly and delivered quietly. People learned not to expect acknowledgement. Complaints vanished into processes that never returned answers. The absence of response became its own message. You are not the audience. You are the data. Caleb and Darius understood this without being taught. They saw how the city spoke about places like theirs, how problems were described in generalities and people reduced to numbers. The system did not need their voices. It had already decided what they represented. According to that logic, boys from this neighborhood were meant to be observed, categorized, and managed, not listened to. Their awareness did not come with bitterness. It came with clarity. They learned which rules mattered and which existed only on paper. They understood the difference between being seen and being noticed. Most of the time, they were neither. Invisibility was the default condition, and it offered a strange kind of freedom. When no one expects anything from you, no one watches closely. That absence of scrutiny allowed patterns to emerge for those patient enough to observe. Eleanor's world and theirs did not intersect in any meaningful way. Her philanthropy occasionally reached places like this, filtered through organizations and initiatives that removed any direct contact. Her name might appear on a banner or plaque, abstract and distant. To the neighborhood, she was not a person. She was a concept associated with announcements and promises that rarely altered daily life. The contrast between her controlled environments and this neighborhood was not simply economic. It was psychological. Eleanor moved through spaces designed to affirm her importance. Caleb and Darius navigated spaces that reminded them, subtly and consistently, of their replaceability. One world revolved around maintaining image. The other focused on maintaining momentum. Stopping to reflect was a luxury few could afford. Survival took precedence over aspiration. Conversations centered on immediate concerns, schedules, resources, risks. Long-term planning existed, but it was cautious and conditional. The future was something to approach carefully, not assume. This orientation shaped how Caleb and Darius processed information. They paid attention to inconsistencies because inconsistencies often signaled trouble. They noticed absences because absence here usually meant neglect. The system assumed their voices would never matter because it had structured itself to function without them. Reporting mechanisms required access they did not have. Credibility was assigned based on proximity to power, not accuracy. Even if they noticed something important, there was no clear path for it to travel upward. The distance between observation and action was too wide. That assumption created comfort for those above. It allowed people like Eleanor to move freely, confident that scrutiny would come only from predictable directions. Critics with platforms, opponents with influence, investigations with formal authority. The idea that attention might originate from a place like this neighborhood never entered her calculations. What Eleanor never realized was that this forgotten place was already watching her closely. Eleanor Whitmore never described her actions as silencing anyone. In her mind, that word carried an unnecessary sense of force, something crude and unsophisticated. What she practiced was resolution. When complications appeared, she addressed them with efficiency, precision, and resources few others possessed. Over time, this approach hardened into a pattern so reliable that it ceased to feel like a choice. It became procedure. Problems surfaced, money moved, and the noise faded. Order was restored without disruption, and Eleanor continued forward without pause. The mechanics of this process were rarely visible. They unfolded quietly through intermediaries, agreements, and subtle pressures that left no obvious fingerprints. Legal frameworks were employed not to uncover truth, but to contain it. Settlements arrived framed as generosity rather than necessity. Support was offered in exchange for discretion, framed as opportunity rather than obligation. The language surrounding these transactions was deliberately neutral, designed to remove emotion from the exchange. Silence was never demanded. It was incentivized. Over time, this approach reshaped the moral landscape around Eleanor. What might have once required justification no longer did. Each successful resolution reinforced the belief that money was not corrupting outcomes, only smoothing them. If everyone walked away materially better off and public harmony was preserved, where was the harm? This logic spread quietly among those who benefited from her influence. Silence became normalized, even expected. It was no longer a concession. It was part of the cost of doing business. The historical pattern was consistent. Concerns arose usually from individuals with limited leverage. Eleanor's network responded swiftly. Legal pressure applied just enough to intimidate, never enough to provoke resistance. Financial offers followed, framed carefully to appear voluntary. Institutions cooperated, grateful for continued support. Each incident concluded without spectacle. No headlines, no investigations, no lasting consequences. The system rewarded compliance and discouraged persistence with remarkable efficiency. As this cycle repeated, the emotional weight of these decisions dulled. What began as uncomfortable compromises transformed into routine transactions. Morality shifted from a guiding principle to a variable in a calculation. The question was no longer whether something should be addressed openly, but whether openness was necessary at all. Convenience replaced conscience not through malice but through repetition. Eleanor did not wake each day intending to suppress truth. She simply followed a model that had never failed her. Those around her adapted accordingly. Advisors spoke in cautious abstractions, avoiding language that might suggest wrongdoing. Documents were drafted to minimize exposure rather than clarify responsibility. Meetings focused on outcomes, not implications. Over time, even the concept of accountability felt outdated. Accountability was for those without resources. For Eleanor, responsibility meant maintaining stability, preserving reputation, and ensuring continuity. Anything that threatened those goals required management, not reflection. Silence, once secured, had a way of validating itself. Each quiet resolution reinforced the belief that nothing truly serious had occurred. If the issue had been significant, surely it would have persisted. If the concerns were legitimate, surely they would have surfaced again. This reasoning allowed Eleanor to dismiss lingering doubts without confronting them directly. The absence of noise became proof of innocence, even when that absence had been carefully engineered. Yet silence is not the same as erasure. Every transaction left behind records, agreements, and patterns that could be traced. Each payout aligned with a timeline. Each intervention corresponded to an event. Individually, these moments appeared insignificant, easily dismissed as coincidences or routine operations. Together, they formed a structure, one built gradually and unintentionally. Eleanor never examined this structure because she had no reason to. It existed beyond her immediate concern, buried beneath layers of professionalism and discretion. The discomfort this system generated never fully disappeared. It lingered at the edges of Eleanor's awareness, surfacing briefly before being suppressed by reassurance. She reminded herself of her contributions, her philanthropy, her public service. She framed her actions as necessary compromises in an imperfect world. This narrative allowed her to move forward without hesitation. The cost of pausing felt greater than the cost of continuing. What Eleanor failed to consider was that silence changes those who accept it. It teaches them to observe carefully, to remember details, to recognize patterns. Those who are paid to forget often remember more than anyone realizes. Silence does not empty the mind. It sharpens it. The very act of suppressing truth requires awareness of it, and awareness leaves impressions that cannot be entirely erased. As the years passed, the volume of silence surrounding Eleanor grew. Each transaction added another layer, another agreement, another expectation of discretion. The system held because everyone involved benefited from its stability. No one had incentive to disturb it. No one, that is, who operated within the same assumptions and constraints. Eleanor believed the structure was closed, impermeable, and secure. What she did not see was that silence accumulates weight. It does not vanish. It settles, compacts, and waits. The more it is relied upon, the more fragile it becomes. A system built on unspoken agreements depends entirely on the belief that no one will connect the dots. Eleanor trusted that belief because it had never been challenged. This time, the silence did not disappear. It accumulated. Caleb Morris and Darius Cole did not set out to uncover anything. They were not looking for truth, justice, or recognition. Their attention was shaped by something far more ordinary and far more demanding: the need to understand their surroundings well enough to navigate them safely. In their world, awareness was not curiosity for its own sake. It was a survival skill refined through repetition. You noticed patterns because missing them carried consequences. Adults around them were busy managing exhaustion. Responsibilities arrived early and multiplied quickly. There was little space left for noticing what did not immediately demand action. Conversations focused on work schedules, bills, transportation, and risk avoidance. The background noise of the city faded into familiarity. People learned to filter out irregularities because acknowledging them rarely led to solutions. It led to frustration. So most adults stopped looking closely, not out of ignorance, but out of fatigue. Caleb and Darius did not have that luxury yet. Their days contained long stretches of waiting for buses, for schools to open, for errands to be completed, for time to pass. That waiting created observation. They watched who passed through the neighborhood and who never stayed. They noticed when unfamiliar cars appeared more than once, when certain faces returned at predictable intervals, when activities clustered around specific times and then vanished. These details did not register as suspicious at first. They registered as interesting. Their intelligence was quiet and uncelebrated. It did not express itself through speeches or dramatic conclusions. It lived in comparison. They remembered how things looked yesterday and noticed when they looked different today. They paid attention to absence as much as presence. When something that was usually there disappeared, they felt the shift. In a place where stability was fragile, change carried meaning. Poverty did not make them invisible to reality, it made reality unavoidable. Without access to distractions designed to occupy attention, they experienced the city directly. Their environment offered few illusions. Things either worked or they did not. People either showed up or they did not. This clarity shaped how they processed information. They trusted repetition more than explanation. If something happened often enough, it mattered. Regardless of what anyone said about it, they began noticing inconsistencies that others dismissed as coincidence. Movements that did not align with official narratives. Activities that occurred just outside the rhythms of the neighborhood. Moments when attention from outside forces intensified briefly and then vanished without explanation. None of this pointed clearly to wrongdoing, but it suggested intention. Someone was managing outcomes carefully, stepping in only when necessary and retreating quickly afterward. Their observations did not grant them protection. If anything, awareness increased vulnerability. Knowing that something was wrong without knowing why created unease. They could not report what they noticed because they lacked language precise enough to describe it. Even if they could, they understood instinctively that their words would carry little weight. The system had already decided who counted as credible. They were not on that list. Curiosity slowly transformed into awareness. The shift was subtle but irreversible. Once they recognized that certain events followed patterns, they could not unsee them. They began connecting moments across time, linking unrelated occurrences through shared characteristics. This process was not dramatic. It unfolded gradually, through quiet recognition rather than revelation. Awareness arrived not with certainty, but with insistence. They did not share these thoughts widely. Experience had taught them that not everything noticed needed to be spoken. Some knowledge was safer held privately, examined carefully before being exposed to the outside world. Observation became an internal process, a way of understanding rather than announcing. In this restraint, they unknowingly took their first step toward resistance. Not defiance, not confrontation, attention. The adults around them remained unaware, not because they were incapable, but because their lives demanded focus elsewhere. Systems depended on this division. Those with the least power often had the most time to observe, while those with authority were shielded by responsibility and routine. Caleb and Darius existed in the gap between oversight and neglect. That gap allowed them to see without being seen. What they noticed did not yet form a complete picture. It was fragmented, incomplete, and ambiguous. But it felt significant. The feeling persisted even when they tried to dismiss it. Something about these patterns did not align with chance. They sensed coordination where others saw randomness. This intuition did not make them bold. It made them cautious. Observation, in their case, was not passive. It required memory, patience, and restraint. Each detail added to a growing internal record. They did not know what this record would become or whether it would ever matter. But they understood that it should be kept intact. Forgetting felt like a loss they could not afford. They did not yet understand what they had discovered, but they knew it mattered. Eleanor Whitmore's strength had always appeared absolute, but it rested on a single, fragile assumption control could be maintained indefinitely. Her wealth allowed her to shape outcomes, redirect attention, and manage narratives with precision. Over time, this ability became less of a tool and more of a dependency. Control was no longer something she exercised when necessary. It was something she required to feel secure. The idea that events could unfold beyond her influence was not merely inconvenient. It was unthinkable. Money, as Eleanor understood it, did not solve problems on its own. It worked only when people participated in the forgetting. Silence required agreement. Discretion required compliance. Every resolution depended on individuals and institutions accepting compensation in exchange for restraint. This system functioned smoothly as long as everyone involved believed that forgetting was both beneficial and final. Eleanor trusted this belief because it had been reinforced repeatedly. Each successful transaction confirmed that control, once purchased, remained intact. Caleb Morris and Darius Cole did not frame their observations in terms of power or weakness. They approached them as puzzles that refused to resolve themselves. Events that seemed unrelated began to echo one another. Timelines aligned too neatly. Certain outcomes followed specific types of attention. When scrutiny appeared, it vanished quickly, replaced by calm and resolution that felt rehearsed. These patterns did not point directly to Eleanor at first. They pointed to intention. What the boys noticed most were the details others overlooked. Small adjustments that occurred quietly after moments of tension. Changes that appeared administrative rather than reactive. The absence of follow-up where follow-up would normally exist. These details did not announce themselves as evidence. They required patience to recognize and restraint to preserve. Each observation alone was meaningless. Together, they suggested design. Their realization unfolded gradually, without celebration or certainty. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden clarity that resolved every question. Instead, understanding arrived as a quiet alignment of fragments. The boys compared memories, tested assumptions, and revisited moments they had previously dismissed. The more they examined these fragments, the more consistent the pattern became. Something was being managed deliberately, and that management relied on predictability. Eleanor's weakness revealed itself not through error, but through repetition. Control requires consistency, and consistency creates trails. The same methods applied over time leave recognizable marks. The boys began to understand that money's effectiveness depended on people choosing silence. Forgetting was not automatic, it was negotiated. That negotiation left behind evidence in the form of timing, behavior, and outcomes. Silence, once bought, still had to be maintained. The emotional weight of this realization was heavy, not exhilarating. Awareness brought responsibility without instruction. The boys did not feel empowered by what they saw. They felt burdened by it. Knowing that something was wrong did not come with a clear path forward. It simply removed the comfort of ignorance. Their discovery did not make them bold. It made them careful. They recognized that Eleanor's control was not invulnerable. It was contingent. It depended on others continuing to participate in the system she had built. If even one part of that system behaved differently, the illusion of control would weaken. This understanding reframed everything they had noticed before. The quiet resolutions were not signs of stability. They were signs of maintenance. The discovery unfolded like a slow, burning scene, absent of spectacle but rich in tension. Each new connection deepened their certainty while increasing their unease. They were not uncovering a secret meant to be found. They were recognizing a structure that assumed it would never be examined from their vantage point. That assumption was Eleanor's blind spot. They understood now that power often overlooks those it deems irrelevant. Eleanor's world was designed to manage threats from above and beside her, not from below. She anticipated opposition from rivals and critics with platforms. She did not anticipate scrutiny from observers without status or incentive. The boys' position outside her field of concern allowed them to see without interference. This realization did not immediately change their behavior. They did not act, speak, or confront. They simply continued observing, now with intention. The difference was internal. What had once been curiosity became documentation. Memory became deliberate. Attention sharpened. They understood that once a pattern is recognized, it cannot be unseen. The moment they saw the pattern, there was no turning back. Knowledge did not arrive for Caleb Morris and Darius Cole as clarity or relief. It arrived as weight. Once the pattern settled into something undeniable, it pressed against them in ways they had not anticipated. Awareness altered how they moved through their days. Familiar streets felt narrower. Ordinary routines carried an undercurrent of caution. They had not done anything wrong, yet the knowledge itself felt like a liability they now carried without consent. The burden was emotional before it was practical. They became more attentive, not out of curiosity but necessity. Every new detail demanded evaluation. Every coincidence required reconsideration. Their minds no longer rested in the spaces between events. Awareness filled those spaces completely. The truth, once glimpsed, refused to remain passive. It demanded vigilance, and vigilance demanded energy they did not always have. They possessed no authority, no platform, no protection. Awareness without power created a specific kind of danger, one that could not be easily named. It was not fear of a particular consequence, but fear of imbalance. Knowing something important while lacking the means to act on it created tension that had no outlet. They could not confront it openly. They could not forget it safely. They existed in a narrow space between silence and exposure, uncertain which carried greater risk. Fear followed them quietly. It did not announce itself as panic or dread. It surfaced as restraint. They spoke less, shared selectively, and avoided drawing attention. They became careful with memory, deciding what to hold and what to release. The fear was not of Eleanor Whitmore specifically, but of the system surrounding her, an apparatus that functioned smoothly, impersonally, and without warning. They understood instinctively that systems rarely reacted kindly to disruption from unexpected directions. The psychological weight of truth altered their sense of time. Days stretched longer, filled with anticipation rather than events. The future felt less open, more conditional. Innocence, once defined by unexamined moments, gave way to responsibility that had not been earned but imposed. They were still young, still navigating the basic demands of their environment, yet they carried an understanding that did not align with their age. This mismatch created quiet isolation. Innocence had not disappeared entirely. It lingered in habits and routines, in moments of distraction and laughter that still occurred. But it no longer defined them. Responsibility had entered without invitation, reshaping how they interpreted the world. They measured actions against potential consequences rather than immediate outcomes. This shift was subtle but profound. It marked the point where observation transformed into obligation. Society remained indifferent. The structures that had rendered them invisible continued to do so. Their awareness did not alter how institutions perceived them. No one sought their insight. No one suspected their attention. This indifference was both protection and confinement. It allowed them to continue observing without interference, but it also confirmed that any attempt to speak would likely be dismissed. The system's neglect reinforced its own stability. They felt the loneliness of holding something significant in a place that offered no acknowledgement. The truth existed within them, unshared and unvalidated. Without external confirmation, doubt occasionally surfaced. They questioned their interpretations, their memories, their conclusions. This self-questioning did not weaken their awareness, it refined it. They learned to test their assumptions carefully, to distinguish between certainty and suspicion. The cost of knowing too early was not immediate consequence, but sustained tension. It demanded restraint where impulse might have once existed. It required patience in moments that called for reaction. They learned to live with incomplete resolution, to accept that understanding does not always lead to action. This acceptance was not resignation. It was adaptation. As time passed, their behavior shifted in ways so subtle they barely noticed. They watched more closely, moved more deliberately, and spoke with greater care. These changes were not dramatic enough to draw attention, but they altered the rhythm of their presence. Patterns they once observed externally now influenced their internal decisions. Awareness had become embedded. What they did not realize was that systems attuned to control noticed changes in rhythm. Not through emotion or intuition, but through variance. Eleanor Whitmore's world was calibrated to consistency. Deviations, however minor, registered eventually. Somewhere within the mechanisms designed to preserve order, a discrepancy emerged, small enough to be overlooked at first, but persistent enough to resist dismissal. And then, Eleanor noticed that something was different. Eleanor Whitmore responded to disruption the only way she knew how, by restoring order. When subtle irregularities surfaced, minor delays, unanswered confirmations, quiet deviations from expected outcomes, she did not interpret them as threats. She interpreted them as inefficiencies. Inefficiencies in her experience were temporary. They required attention, resources, and correction, nothing more. Her usual mechanisms activated smoothly. Advisors reviewed timelines. Legal teams revisited prior resolutions. Financial channels opened with practiced discretion. The system moved with confidence born of repetition. It had handled far more visible complications without consequence. This situation, whatever its source, appeared manageable. Eleanor trusted the process because the process had never betrayed her, but this time the response did not produce the expected calm. The movements occurred, yet the effects lagged. Follow-ups arrived incomplete. Assurances felt rehearsed rather than definitive. The system responded automatically, but incorrectly, as if applying a familiar solution to a problem that had quietly changed shape. Eleanor noticed the delay first as inconvenience, then as irritation. Control depended on timing. Delays suggested resistance. Caleb Morris and Darius Cole were not aware of these internal maneuvers. They did not see the emails, the meetings, the recalibrations. What they noticed was absence. The familiar pattern of quiet resolution did not follow scrutiny as it always had. Instead, attention lingered. Certain actions repeated without closure. The silence they had come to recognize as manufactured did not settle into place. It hovered incomplete. The boys did not respond as the system anticipated. Not because they resisted openly, but because they did nothing at all. They neither accepted nor rejected what moved around them. They did not forget, but they also did not speak. This neutrality disrupted the transaction. Silence, when purchased, required cooperation. What Caleb and Darius offered was not cooperation, but refusal to participate in forgetting. This refusal was subtle enough to evade immediate detection, yet significant enough to destabilize expectation. The system relied on predictable reactions: acceptance, denial, retreat. It had no protocol for sustained observation without engagement. The absence of response created uncertainty. Uncertainty demanded attention, and attention was the one thing Eleanor's solutions were designed to eliminate. Emotional tension rose not through confrontation, but through imbalance. Eleanor sensed it before she could define it. Meetings extended longer than necessary. Conversations circled without resolution. The reassurance she once felt at the conclusion of each intervention failed to arrive. Control, which had always felt solid beneath her decisions, began to feel conditional. Silence was no longer available as a commodity. It could not be secured, only attempted. Each attempt revealed its own limitation. The system, built to suppress noise, was ill-equipped to address quiet persistence. Caleb and Darius remained invisible in the conventional sense, Yet their continued awareness disrupted outcomes more effectively than any accusation could have. For the first time, Eleanor confronted the possibility that control required consent she did not possess. The realization unsettled her, not because it threatened exposure, but because it challenged the foundation of her confidence. Her power had always depended on predictability. This situation resisted it. She began to feel watched, not by an audience, but by an absence she could not locate. The discomfort was unfamiliar. It did not resemble fear or panic. It resembled vulnerability, a sense that something essential had shifted beyond her reach. The system still functioned, but its authority felt diminished, its certainty compromised. For the first time, Eleanor felt exposed. The shift did not arrive as an announcement or a spectacle. There were no dramatic revelations, no sudden confrontations that demanded attention. Instead, it unfolded the way pressure releases after being held too long, quietly, steadily, and without ceremony. What had been accumulating beneath layers of silence began to surface not as accusation, but as alignment. Separate records, overlooked details, and unresolved moments converged into something coherent enough to be recognized by systems that could no longer ignore them. Public reality has a threshold. It tolerates ambiguity until patterns become undeniable. When that threshold is crossed, the response is rarely emotional. It is procedural. Reviews are initiated, audits expand. Questions multiply. None of this appears extraordinary on its own, but together it signals a change in posture. Eleanor Whitmore sensed this shift before it became visible to others. The tone of interactions changed. Requests became more precise. Assumptions were replaced by verification. The deference she once received without question softened into caution. The accumulated evidence did not accuse her directly. It did something far more destabilizing. It suggested that her influence had limits. The mechanisms she relied upon to manage outcomes began to hesitate, constrained by processes that demanded documentation rather than discretion. Her name still carried weight, but that weight no longer settled arguments automatically. Each intervention required justification. Each request invited scrutiny. The efficiency she depended on slowed to a pace she could not control. This was not an explosion of truth. It was an exposure through inevitability. Once enough fragments aligned, ignoring them required active effort. Institutions adjusted not out of courage, but out of obligation. They responded to consistency rather than outrage. Eleanor's influence did not vanish overnight. It eroded incrementally, losing its certainty first, then its reach. Power, when questioned, rarely collapses all at once. It weakens where it once felt strongest. Caleb Morris and Darius Cole remained absent from the narrative that emerged. Their names did not appear in reports or discussions. Their presence was never acknowledged. They were not witnesses in the conventional sense. They were catalysts whose role was completed the moment the system began to move on its own. Their effectiveness lay precisely in their invisibility. By never stepping forward, they allowed the focus to remain on the structure rather than the source. From a distance, the outcome appeared measured, even restrained. No dramatic statements were issued. No symbolic gestures attempted to reclaim public trust. The response favored containment over confession. Eleanor's position shifted subtly. Invitations became conditional. Endorsements paused. Support required review. The collapse was not personal. It was functional. Influence that could no longer guarantee outcomes ceased to be influence at all. The emotional payoff arrived without celebration. There was no sense of victory. No release of tension into relief. Justice, when delivered through systems, often lacks satisfaction. It corrects rather than consoles. For those who had been silenced, the change offered acknowledgement without closure. For Eleanor, it delivered consequence without spectacle. The balance restored itself imperfectly, leaving everyone involved altered but not resolved. The boys watched this unfold from a distance, aware that the shift they had anticipated was finally occurring. They did not feel triumph. They felt confirmation. The pattern they had observed now existed beyond their perception. It had entered public reality, independent of their attention. This independence was both reassuring and disorienting. The weight they carried lessened, but it did not disappear. Knowing that something had changed did not explain what would come next. The bittersweet nature of the moment settled in gradually. The system had responded, but it had not transformed. Eleanor's influence diminished, but the structures that enabled her remained largely intact. Corrections were applied where necessary, not where ideal. The boys understood this intuitively. They had never expected resolution. They had expected movement. Movement in their world was the closest thing to progress. Eleanor experienced the shift as a narrowing of space. Options that once felt abundant became constrained. The certainty that guided her decisions dissolved into calculation. She remained composed, outwardly unchanged, but the internal architecture of her confidence had fractured. Control, once assumed, now required negotiation. This adjustment did not humble her. It unsettled her. The absence of control revealed how much of her identity had depended on it. The power shift was complete not when Eleanor lost everything, but when she lost inevitability. Outcomes were no longer guaranteed by her involvement. That loss marked the true climax of the story. Power that must be argued for is already diminished. Influence that requires explanation has begun to fade. From the outside, the city continued as it always had. Daily life absorbed the change without ceremony. News cycles moved on. Attention shifted elsewhere. The moment passed quietly, leaving behind altered trajectories rather than definitive endings. This was not a story that demanded remembrance. It was one that demonstrated consequence. But exposure does not mean healing. Some stories aren't meant to be watched once and forgotten. They stay with you because they reveal how quietly power really works. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see the system differently, let it travel further. That's how stories like this survive. If money can buy silence, but silence can still leave evidence, then how many truths do you think we've already walked past without noticing?